Part 1, 240,000 human beings, dead on an island 60 miles long in 82 days. 1 in 4 Okinawan civilians on that island at the beginning of the battle was dead by the end of it. The highest per capita civilian death rate of any battle of the entire Second World War. 12,520 Americans dead. 4,907 of them as sea sailors. More Navy sailors dead in that one campaign than at Pearl Harbor and Guadalcanal combined. Somewhere in your family, there is a father or a grandfather or a great uncle who came home from the Pacific in 1945 and did not talk about what he had seen. The odds are better than 1 in 3 that he was on Okinawa or on a ship offshore of it or in the sky above it. He did not tell you what happened there. Most of them did not. Tonight I am going to tell you, because from the Japanese perspective, in that spring of 1945, they were winning. That is the part of this story that most Americans have never been told. June 10th, 1945, afternoon. A tent at 10th Army Headquarters near Yontan Airfield on the western coast of Okinawa. PBM Mariner flying boat has just landed in the lagoon. A man in a khaki service uniform walks up from the beach. 60 years old, 5'8", blue eyes, iron hair, no ribbons on his chest. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. He has flown from Guam that morning. He walks into the tent. Behind a folding table, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. stands to greet him. Buckner is 58 years old, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, son of a Confederate general. West Point class of 1908, 3 years after Nimitz graduated from Annapolis. He commands the United States 10th Army on Okinawa. For 70 days, he has been trying to break the Japanese defensive line in the south of the island. For 70 days, his men have been dying in front of a system of coral caves and reverse slope artillery positions that the Japanese have been preparing since August of 1944. Nimitz does not sit down. He looks at Buckner across the folding table, speaks quietly. He says one sentence. "I'm losing a ship and a half a day out here. If this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone in here to move it who can." Tent is silent. Buckner is a large man, a professional soldier, the son of a Confederate lieutenant general, and he has been in the Army for 37 years. He has never in his career been spoken to that way by a superior officer. He does not answer immediately. Then he says, "I understand." Nimitz turns. He walks out of the tent. He goes back to the PBM in the lagoon, flies back to Guam. 8 days later, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. will be dead, killed by fragments of coral rock driven into his chest at a forward observation post overlooking Misato on southern Okinawa. Highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the entire Second World War. 12 days after that, meeting in the tent, the Japanese commander on Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, 57 years old, will commit ritual suicide in a cave on Mabuni Hill at 4 o'clock in the morning. To understand how it came to that, how one American fleet admiral flew from Guam to say one sentence to one Army general in a tent, you have to understand 3 things about Okinawa that most people watching to this do not know. The first is that Okinawa was not Japan. The Ryukyu Islands, of which Okinawa is the largest, had been an independent kingdom for 450 years, from 1429 until 1879. The kingdom paid tribute to the Chinese emperor. Its capital was Shuri. It had its own language, its own culture, its own royal family, its own religion. In 1879, the government of Meiji Japan, 66 years before the American 10th Army landed on the Hagushi beaches, forcibly annexed the Ryukyu Kingdom and made it a Japanese prefecture. The Okinawans became Japanese subjects. They did not become Japanese. For 66 years, the Okinawans lived under Tokyo's rule as second-class colonial subjects. They spoke a language that mainland Japanese could not understand. They were discriminated against for their darker skin and their poverty. They were taxed. They were drafted. They were treated as expendable labor. When the American invasion came in 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army, defending Okinawa, conscripted 24,000 young Okinawan men into a home guard called the WWII. Boys as young as 14, men as old as 60. Given a rifle, a hand grenade, and told to die for an emperor whose language they did not speak. That is the first thing. The second thing is that the Japanese commander on Okinawa did not intend to win the battle. Mitsuru Ushijima had assumed command of the 32nd Army in August of 1944. He had been given a defensive plan by his operations officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, a plan that was, in its cold and calculating clarity, one of the most sophisticated defensive strategies of the Second World War. The plan was this: do not defend the beaches. Do not fight a decisive battle. Do not counterattack. Withdraw all forces into the mountains of southern Okinawa. Prepare deep tunnels and connected cave systems in the coral limestone. When the Americans land, let them land. When the Americans advance, make them pay for every yard. Bleed them. Bleed them slowly, methodically, remorselessly, until the American public, reading the casualty lists at breakfast in Ohio and Georgia and California, demanded that the war be ended by negotiation rather than by an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The American killed on Okinawa was, from the Japanese perspective, a vote in Washington against Operation Downfall. That was the strategy. Ushijima accepted it. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isasam Cho, opposed it. Cho was aggressive. Cho wanted counterattacks. Cho believed in the offensive spirit of the Japanese army. Cho was overruled. For 7 months, from August of 1944 until April of 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army dug caves. They dug more than 1,000 of them. Some of them were miles long. They dug them into the karst limestone hills south of Shuri, the ancient capital. They connected them with tunnels. They placed artillery on the reverse slopes, invisible from the sky. They placed machine guns in the cave mouths, covering every approach. They pre-registered artillery fire on every likely American axis of advance. By the 1st of April, 1945, everything was ready. Trap was set. That is the second thing. The third thing is that when the Americans came, on Easter Sunday morning, they walked into the trap unopposed. The 1st of April, 1945, was 2 holidays at once. Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day. At 8:30 in the morning, 60,000 American Marines and soldiers began coming ashore on the Hagushi beaches on the west coast of Okinawa. Iwo Jima had ended 6 days earlier. Iwo Jima had cost the United States Marine Corps 26,000 casualties in 36 days of fighting on 8 square miles of black volcanic sand. The American commanders expected Okinawa to be worse. They expected a bloodbath on the beaches. There was no bloodbath, no resistance at all. Marines walked across the coral without being fired on. They set up defensive positions on the beach and waited for the counterattack that had defined every previous American landing in the Pacific. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. On every one of those islands, the Japanese had contested the beaches with everything they had. On Okinawa, the beaches were empty. By evening, 60,000 Americans were ashore. 4 airfields had been captured. Casualties were minimal. American commanders were confused. Where were the Japanese? The Japanese were 15 miles to the south, in the caves, waiting. Yahara's plan was working perfectly. And on that same first day of April, in a cave on Yomitan Peninsula called Chibichinigama, 140 Okinawan civilians were hiding underground. Japanese soldiers were with them. The soldiers had told the civilians for weeks, "The Americans will rape you. The Americans will torture your children. The Americans will kill you slowly." The civilians believed it. They had no reason not to. They had been told this by their government, by their soldiers, by their teachers, by their neighbors for years. On the 1st of April, as American Marines walked ashore 15 miles to the south, the civilians of Chibichinigama began to kill themselves. Some drank poison. Some cut their own throats with razors. Mothers cut the throats of their own children first, and then their own. Grandfathers strangled grandchildren. Fathers killed daughters. By the end of the day, 85 of the 140 were dead. Most of them were children under 12 years old. The first day of the Battle of Okinawa. 85 dead Okinawan civilians in a single cave on the west coast of the island, killed by their own hands and by the hands of their families, because they had been told to fear men they would never meet. No American soldier had come within 2 miles of Chibichiri-Gama. The Americans never would. The Marines walked past. They did not know what was in the cave. Nobody would know for years. The battle had not started, and it had already killed more people than most battles ever kill, and it had 82 days to run. By dawn on the 2nd of April, the American 10th Army was moving inland. They advanced across the middle of Okinawa unopposed. They took hills that should have been contested. They swept east across the narrow waist of the island. Within 4 days, they had cut Okinawa in half. Still, no Japanese resistance. The intelligence officers wrote confused reports. Where was the Japanese 32nd Army? Had they been evacuated? Had they surrendered? Was there some strategic collapse the Americans had missed? None of it. The Japanese 32nd Army was 15 miles south, in the Shuri line, in the caves, in position, waiting. On the 3rd of April, Marines of the 6th Marine Division began pushing north across the Motobu Peninsula. On the 4th of April, Army units of the 24th Corps began pushing south toward Shuri. The Marines to the north would fight a hard but relatively brief campaign against isolated Japanese units on the Motobu Peninsula. The Army to the south was walking into the trap. By April 5th, the lead elements of the 96th Infantry Division reached the outer defensive lines north of Kakazu Ridge. They ran into a wall of fire, machine guns from cave mouths, artillery from reverse slopes, mortars from concealed positions, snipers from ridges they could not see. The 96th Division took hundreds of casualties in the first days. By nightfall, they were pinned down. By the next day, they had been thrown back. The Battle of Okinawa had begun in earnest, and on the 6th of April, the Japanese launched the first Kikusui, Part 2 Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. The name came from a 14th century Japanese warrior clan whose emblem had been a chrysanthemum flower floating on running water, a symbol of loyalty, a symbol of a death that would beautify a defeat. By April of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had almost ceased to exist as a surface force. The battleships were gone. The aircraft carriers were gone. What was left were pilots, many of them very young, most of them poorly trained, and airplanes, most of them obsolete. But there was something else. There was a decision. The decision had been made in October of 1944 in the Philippines during the Leyte Gulf campaign, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the Japanese Naval Air Forces at Mabalacat Airfield, had ordered the first organized suicide attacks against American ships. By April of 1945, the tactic had grown into an entire strategic concept. The 6th of April, 699 Japanese aircraft, 355 of them explicitly designated as kamikazes, took off from airfields in Kyushu and Formosa and struck the American fleet at Okinawa in a single coordinated wave. That wave was called Kikusui No. 1. Between the 6th of April and the 22nd of June, there would be 10 of them, 1,900 kamikaze sorties total over 11 weeks. The results were unlike anything American naval planners had ever imagined. 36 United States Navy ships would be sunk at Okinawa. 368 more would be damaged. 4,907 American sailors would be killed. 763 American aircraft would be lost. It was by the end the deadliest naval campaign the United States Navy had ever fought. More Navy sailors would die at Okinawa than at Pearl Harbor. More Navy sailors would die at Okinawa than at Guadalcanal. More Navy sailors would die at Okinawa than in any other single campaign of the Second World War. Chester Nimitz's office on Guam, the daily loss reports began stacking up in his in-tray. Ships hit. Ships sunk. Sailors dead. Sailors missing. Sailors burned. Sailors drowned. Every day. Every single day. On the 18th of April, 12 days after the first Kikusui, the war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed on the island of Aishima. Pyle was 44 years old. He had been born in Indiana on the 3rd of August, 1900. He had spent the last 4 years traveling with American troops through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He wrote a daily column that ran in 300 American newspapers. He was, by 1945, probably the most widely read journalist in the United States. He wrote about ordinary soldiers. He learned their names. He told their stories in short, quiet sentences that Americans back home read at their kitchen tables and cried over. In February of 1945, Pyle had transferred to the Pacific Theater. He landed with the 77th Infantry Division on Aishima, a small island off the Motobu Peninsula on the northwest coast of Okinawa, on the 17th of April. The next morning, riding in a jeep with a lieutenant colonel, he was hit in the left temple by a Japanese machine gun bullet. He died instantly. He was buried on Aishima that afternoon in a grave with a wooden marker. The marker said, "At this spot, the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle, 18 April 1945. President Truman issued a statement. The nation mourned. Every newspaper in America ran his last column above the fold on the 20th of April. Ernie Pyle's death, 17 days after the American landings, was the first sign to the American public that Okinawa was not going to be a quick campaign. For the men on the island, it had been obvious for 2 weeks. Down in the south, in front of the Shuri line, the American army was learning what Colonel Hiromichi Yahara had built. The terrain of southern Okinawa is not like anything most American soldiers had ever seen. It is karst limestone, porous, cavernous, riddled with sinkholes and coral outcrops and hidden vertical drops. The Japanese had spent 7 months turning this terrain into a fortress. Every hill had multiple firing positions. Every valley was covered by pre-registered artillery. Every trail had been mined. Every cave mouth had a machine gun waiting. American infantry attacked hills that could not be flanked because the flanks led into other Japanese positions. They took hilltops in the morning and were driven off them at night by Japanese infiltrators who came up through tunnels the Americans had not known existed. Casualty rates ran between 100 and 300 men a day on the American line. Advance rates were measured in yards. By early May, the 24th Corps had been fighting for 5 weeks and had advanced approximately 5,000 yards, less than 3 miles. At that rate, taking the southern third of Okinawa would consume the American army until the following winter. Chester Nimitz on Guam watched the daily reports. Ships lost, sailors dead, yards gained. The math did not work. The 3rd and 4th of May, the Japanese made one strategic mistake of the entire campaign. Lieutenant General Isamu Cho had been arguing for a counteroffensive since the beginning of April. Cho believed that the defensive strategy was cowardly. Cho believed that Japanese honor required Japanese aggression. Cho believed that if the 32nd Army struck the Americans hard enough, the American offensive would collapse. Colonel Yahara opposed the counteroffensive. Yahara said plainly that any Japanese unit that left the caves would be destroyed by American artillery, American naval gunfire, and American air power within hours. Ushijima listened to both. Then he made his mistake. Under pressure from Cho and from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, which wanted visible battlefield victories, Ushijima authorized a general counteroffensive. On the night of the 3rd of May, coordinated with Kikusui No. 5 in the water offshore, 15,000 Japanese soldiers left their caves and attacked the American lines. They were annihilated. American artillery, ready and pre-registered, poured fire onto Japanese assembly areas. American infantry, dug in and waiting, mowed down the attacking columns. American aircraft, unopposed in the sky, hit anything that moved on Japanese-held ground. By the morning of the 5th of May, 5,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The offensive collapsed. Ushijima, in his cave headquarters, wept. Turned to Yahara. He said, "I should have listened to you." The Japanese would not launch another offensive. Yahara's defensive strategy was resumed. But 5,000 veteran Japanese infantry, the men Ushijima needed to hold the Shuri line, were gone. In the water offshore, on the 11th of May, the flagship of the American Fast Carrier Task Force was hit. USS Bunker Hill was an Essex-class aircraft carrier, 27,000 tons, 2,600 men aboard. She was the flagship of Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher, a small, weathered, 58-year-old naval aviator from Hillsboro, Wisconsin, who had been flying since 1916 and commanding carriers since Midway. At 8:22 in the morning on the 11th of May, a Japanese Zero fighter carrying a 550-pound bomb came in low from astern. The Zero hit the flight deck of Bunker Hill aft of the island. The bomb went through the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck below, among a full load of fueled and armed American aircraft preparing for launch. 30 seconds later, a second kamikaze, a Zero, flown by a 22-year-old ensign named Kiyoshi Ogawa, hit the ship near the island itself. Fire spread through the hangar. Fuel exploded. Ammunition cooked off. Men in the hangar deck were killed by the fire, or by concussion, or by their own aircraft exploding around them. Men trapped in the ready rooms below the flight deck suffocated in the smoke. 393 American sailors were killed on Bunker Hill in less than a minute. 264 were wounded. The ship survived barely and limped back to Ulithi for repairs. She would not fight again in the war. Mark Mitcher transferred his flag to USS Enterprise. 3 days later, on the 14th of May, USS Enterprise was hit by another kamikaze. Mitcher transferred his flag again to USS Randolph. He was 58 years old. He had commanded the Fast Carrier Task Force through the Marshalls, through the Marianas, through the Philippine Sea, through the Philippines, through Iwo Jima, through Okinawa. He had watched his flagships burn under him twice in 3 days. He had watched men he knew die around him. He would come home to the United States at the end of 1945. He would be promoted to full admiral in March of 1946. 11 months after that, on the 3rd of February, 1947, Mark Mitcher would die of a heart attack in Norfolk, Virginia, at the age of 60. His doctors would attribute the heart attack to the accumulated stress of the last 2 years of the war. Chester Nimitz, on Guam, watched the reports come in. USS Bunker Hill, 393 dead. USS Enterprise, 14 dead. Kikasui number 6, 22 ships hit, 4 sunk. Kikasui number 7, 19 ships hit, 5 sunk. The daily losses were relentless. And on the ground, the American 10th Army had still not broken through the Shuri line. On the 10th of June, Nimitz got on a PBM Mariner on Guam and flew to Okinawa for the second time. He walked into the tent at 10th Army headquarters near Yantan. He looked across the folding table at Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., the son of a Confederate general, 6 feet tall, methodical, devout, professional, and he said the sentence, "I'm losing a ship and a half a day out here. If this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone in here to move it who can." Buckner said quietly, "I understand." There were staff officers in the tent. There was Major General Roy Geiger, the 60-year-old Marine aviator who commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps and would, 10 days later, become the first Marine officer in the history of the United States to command a field army. Nobody said anything else. Nimitz turned around and walked out. He went back to the Mariner. He flew back to Guam. Nimitz did not put anything on paper. He simply left Buckner alone with the sentence. 8 days later, Buckner would be dead. Whether the acceleration in the American offensive after the 10th of June was caused by Nimitz's sentence or by the collapse of the Shuri line, after the failed Japanese counteroffensive, or by the exhaustion of the Japanese defenders after 70 days of grinding combat, historians still argue about. Probably all three. What is not in doubt is that between the 10th of June and the 22nd of June, the American 10th Army broke the Japanese defensive system on Okinawa and drove the survivors into the last small perimeter around Mabuni Hill on the southern tip of the island. And in that final perimeter, the last chapter of the battle became the death of the civilians. There were, in the summer of 1945, roughly 450,000 Okinawan civilians on the island. Many of them had been evacuated to the north before the battle. Many had gone to Kyushu on transports in 1944. But somewhere between 200 and 300,000 civilians remained on the island when the fighting started, and the majority of them were in the south, in the same area where the Japanese 32nd Army had built its defensive lines. As the American advance pushed south in June of 1945, these civilians were trapped between the two armies. They hid in caves. Japanese soldiers hid in the same caves. When the Americans found the caves, they could not tell the civilians from the soldiers. They used flamethrowers. They used satchel charges. They dropped grenades through the openings. Everyone inside died, soldiers and civilians together. And where the American flamethrowers did not reach, Japanese soldiers who had told the Okinawan civilians for months that the Americans would rape them and torture them and kill their children now told the civilians that the honorable course was suicide. They handed out hand grenades. They handed out cyanide. They told parents to kill their children first and then themselves. Thousands of Okinawan civilians did exactly that in June of 1945. On the cliffs at Mabuni, the same cliffs where Ushijima and Cho would soon commit their own ritual suicides, hundreds of Okinawan civilians jumped to their deaths onto the rocks below. In the caves of the Ihara district, on the 18th of June, an American flamethrower attack on a Japanese field hospital killed more than 100 Japanese Army nurses, most of them Okinawan girls. Mobilized from two elite high schools in Naha and given the name Himayuri Gakudo-tai, the Himayuri Student Corps. 240 girls had been mobilized on the 22nd of March. By the end of June, 224 of them were dead. One of the survivors was a 17-year-old girl named Miyagi Kikuko. She lived through the collapse of Ihara Cave. She walked out of the caves days after the attack and surrendered to American Marines who fed her from their own rations. She would live into old age. She would spend the rest of her life telling school children what happened at Ihara. The Himayuri Peace Museum would be built near the site of the cave in 1989, 44 years after the flamethrowers came. 224 photographs of dead Himayuri girls hang on the walls of that museum today. The youngest of them was 15. That is what Okinawa was. Not just a battle between two armies. A battle in which the civilian population of an occupied island, colonial subjects of one empire, victims of another, told by their own government that suicide was more honorable than surrender to men who had no intention of harming them, died at a rate that no other battle of the Second World War came close to matching. 100,000 Okinawan civilians died between the 1st of April and the 22nd of June, 1945. Some estimates are higher, 150,000, perhaps more. Part 3. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on the 18th of June, 1945, 4 days before the battle would end, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. walked forward to a coral observation post on a ridge overlooking Mezado on southern Okinawa to watch the Marine 8th Regiment attack. He was 58 years old. He was 6 feet tall. He was in the 68th day of the campaign. He carried no rifle. He carried binoculars, wore no helmet with rank showing. He had come forward, as he had many times, to see the ground his men were fighting for with his own eyes. At approximately 1:25, a Japanese gun, probably a 47mm anti-tank gun, some sources say it was a 75mm mountain gun, The historians do not fully agree, fired 5 rounds at the coral outcrop from a position further south. One of the rounds struck the coral rock a few feet from Buckner. The rock exploded into fragments. The fragments drove into Buckner's chest. He fell. He was carried down the hill by his aides. He died within 10 minutes. He was the highest-ranking officer of any American armed force killed by enemy fire in the entire Second World War. The only 3-star American general killed by enemy action in the war. He would be promoted posthumously by an act of Congress in 1954 to the rank of full general 9 years after his death. His body was flown home to Kentucky. He was buried in Frankfort Cemetery beside his father, Confederate Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who had died in 1914 at the age of 90. His widow, Adele Buckner, received a letter of condolence from President Harry Truman. Command of the 10th Army passed, for the first time in the history of the United States military, to a Marine officer, Major General Roy Geiger. 60 years old, the aviator who had been in the tent when Nimitz had spoken his sentence 8 days earlier. Geiger would command the 10th Army for 5 days. On the 23rd of June, General Joseph Stilwell would arrive from the United States to take permanent command. By then, the battle was over. Because on the morning of the 22nd of June, 1945, 4 days after Buckner's death, in a cave on Mabuni Hill on the southern tip of Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho sat down on a white sheet spread over the coral floor of their headquarters cave and prepared to die. Ushijima was 57 years old. Cho was 51. They wore full-dress uniform. The cave opened toward the sea. Ushijima and Cho knelt facing east, toward the Japanese home islands beyond the horizon. The moon had set. The sky was just beginning to lighten. It was approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara was in the cave with them. Yahara was 43 years old. He had been the strategic mind of the Japanese defense for the last 10 months. He had written the plan. He had watched the plan work. He had watched Cho override the plan on the 3rd of May and lose 5,000 men in 2 days. He had watched the plan fail in the end, not because it was wrong, but because the American material superiority was too great and the American willingness to accept casualties was too high. He wanted to die with his commanders. Ushijima refused. Ushijima ordered him, "You cannot commit suicide. Your death is not permitted. Go to headquarters in the mainland. Tell them what happened here." Yahara bowed. He would obey. Ushijima and Cho drank ceremonial sake. Ushijima took the short sword. He opened his belly with the ceremonial cut. His second, a young officer selected in advance, brought a long sword down on Ushijima's neck. Ushijima died instantly. Cho followed. Yahara walked out of the cave alone. He walked north. He would be captured by American forces 23 days later, on the 15th of July, still wearing his uniform. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He would be released in 1946. In 1948, he would publish a memoir in Japanese called Okinawa Kessen, The Battle for Okinawa. The book would explain, in Yahara's careful, quiet, professional voice, exactly what the Japanese defensive plan had been, exactly why it had been chosen, exactly how it had worked, and exactly why it had failed. It would be translated into English in 1995. Yahara would die on the 7th of May, 1981, at the age of 79, in Japan. He would live as Ushijima had commanded him to live for 36 more years. He would carry the truth for all of them. The battle was over. Counting began. 12,520 Americans dead. 4,907 of Navy sailors, the highest single-campaign Navy death toll of the entire Second World War. 7,613 of them soldiers and Marines. 36,000 more American wounded. 26,000 additional American non-battle casualties. Most of them psychiatric combat fatigue, breakdowns, the effect of 82 days of continuous artillery and continuous kamikaze attack. 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead, most of them buried in the caves they had defended. Roughly 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead. Some estimates 150,000. 36 American Navy ships sunk. 368 American Navy ships damaged. 763 American aircraft lost. 4,000 or more Japanese aircraft destroyed. 240,000 human beings dead on an island 60 miles long in 82 days. In Washington, in the Pentagon, and in the White House, and in the offices of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the men who were planning the invasion of the Japanese home islands looked at the Okinawa casualty figures and did the math. Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, scheduled for the 1st of November, 1945, was expected, based on the Okinawa casualty rates extrapolated to the larger population and greater defensive terrain of Kyushu, to cost the United States somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million casualties. Operation Coronet, the planned invasion of the main Japanese island of Honshu, scheduled for the 1st of March, 1946, was expected to cost another 500,000. Total projected American casualties for the invasion of Japan, if Okinawa was the pattern, perhaps 1.5 million men over the following 18 months. Mitsuru Ushijima's strategy, the strategy he had accepted from Colonel Yahara in September of 1944, had worked exactly as Yahara had designed it to work. It had made the invasion of Japan seem, to American planners, impossibly expensive. President Harry Truman looked at the Okinawa numbers. He looked at the Operation Olympic projections. He looked at what was waiting for him in the Nevada desert, at a place called Alamogordo, where a new kind of weapon was about to be tested for the first time. On the 16th of July, 24 days after Ushijima's suicide, the world's first atomic bomb was detonated at the Trinity test site in New Mexico. The 6th of August, a B-29 named Enola Gay, flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets out of Tinian in the Marianas, dropped a uranium fission weapon on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Somewhere between 80 and 140,000 Japanese civilians died in the first day. On the 9th of August, a B-29 named Boxcar, flown by Major Charles Sweeney out of Tinian, dropped a plutonium fission weapon on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Somewhere between 40 and 70,000 Japanese civilians died in the first day. On the 15th of August, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast to the Japanese people. It was the first time in Japanese history that the emperor's voice had been heard by his subjects. On the 2nd of September, 1945, on the teak deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz signed the Japanese surrender document as the representative of the United States. He was 60 years old. He had commanded the Pacific Fleet for 3 years and 9 months. He was standing 12 weeks after he had said the sentence to Buckner in the tent on Okinawa. Colonel Yahara's strategy had contributed in a way Yahara himself could never have intended, the decision to end the war with atomic weapons. The bleeding had continued. It had just moved. From the Boitai conscripts of Okinawa and the Himayuri student nurses of Ihara Cave, and the 85 civilians of Chibichirigama who killed their children on the first day of the battle rather than let them meet Americans they would never meet, to Hiroshima. And Nagasaki, 200,000 Japanese civilians who died in cities that had been chosen as targets partly because Okinawa had made the invasion unthinkable. That is what Okinawa was. That is what it did. That is what it means. In Frankfort, Kentucky, in Frankfort Cemetery, there is a grave marked Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., 1886 to 1945. It is beside the grave of his father, Confederate Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Sr., a man who was born the son of a losing general and died as the highest-ranking American killed in a winning war. In San Bruno, California, at Golden Gate National Cemetery, there is a grave marked Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz 1885 to 1966. He would live for another 21 years after the war ended. He would refuse, for all of those years, to write a memoir. When asked why, he would say that he would have to write about people he had known. In Kagoshima, Japan, there is a grave of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, 1887 to 1945. His body was never recovered from the cave on Mabuni Hill. The grave contains no remains. It contains only his name. In Arlington National Cemetery, in Virginia, there is a grave marked Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher, 1887 to 1947. He was 60 years old when he died of a heart attack 20 months after the war ended. His doctors attributed the heart attack to the accumulated stress of watching his flagships burn under him in the spring of 1945. At the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, in the Punch Bowl in Honolulu, there is a grave marked Ernest Taylor Pyle, 1900 to 1945. He was 44 years old when he was shot in the temple on the island of Aishima, 17 days into the Battle of Okinawa. His grave is in Section D, Site 109, in Okinawa. On the southern tip of the island, at Mabuni Peace Memorial Park, stands the Cornerstone of Peace. It is a series of black granite walls. Inscribed on the walls, in Japanese and in English, are the names of every human being who died on Okinawa between the 26th of March and the 7th of September, 1945. Americans, Japanese, Koreans, British sailors, Okinawan civilians. 240,000 names, every one of them, because Okinawa was not a battle between two armies. Okinawa was a battle that killed nearly everyone within reach of it. Somewhere in Japan, in a cemetery whose exact location is not known to most Americans, is the grave of Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, 1902 to 1981. He lived as his commander had ordered him to live for 36 more years after the 22nd of June, 1945. He carried the truth in his memoir, and the memoir carried it forward. In Okinawa, at the Himayori Peace Museum, in a building constructed near Ihara Cave in 1989, hang 224 photographs of high school girls who were mobilized in March of 1945 and were dead by the 18th of June. Miyagi Kikuko lived through that cave. She was 17 years old. She spent the rest of her life telling school children what happened there. She had been fighting to make sure the girls in the photographs were remembered for more than 60 years by the time she went. And on the 10th of June, 1945, in a tent at 10th Army Headquarters near Yontan on Okinawa, a 60-year-old fleet admiral from Fredericksburg, Texas, walked in from a flying boat that had brought him from Guam, looked across a folding table at a 58-year-old lieutenant general who was the son of a Confederate general and the commander of the biggest field army the United States had ever put ashore in the Pacific, and said one sentence. He said, "I'm losing a ship and a half a day out here. If this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone in here to move it who can." Buckner said, "I understand." 8 days later, Buckner was dead on a coral ridge above Mezado. 12 days later, Ushijima and Cho were dead in a cave on Mabuni Hill. 83 days after that, Nimitz signed the surrender on the deck of the Missouri. He came home, he went to Berkeley, he planted a garden. He spent the last 20 years of his life not talking about it, which is exactly what the men who did not come home, American, Japanese, Okinawan, would have wanted him to do. Live, carry the weight, remember them. Every name on the cornerstone of peace. Every photograph on the walls of the Himayori Peace Museum. Every stone in Frankfurt Cemetery and Golden Gate and Arlington and Punch Bowl and Kagoshima. The ones who did not come home from Okinawa are the reason the war ended when it did, and the reason it ended the way it did. And a boy who was born above a tavern in Fredericksburg, Texas, in 1885, who was court-martialed at 23, who was passed over 28 admirals in 1941, who walked into a tent on Okinawa on the 10th of June, 1945, and said one sentence, is one of the reasons any of us are here to remember them tonight. He never told the story. He carried it quietly for the rest of his life. That is what the ones who came home always do. That is why we remember them.